Hey everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the Endgame Gear OP1 AKV2. Now, as I talked about in my full review, the V2 is a fantastic follow-up to the legendary V1, with all the improvements Endgame Gear has done on the internals here, as all said changes make this mouse a much more well-rounded product compared to the V1, and one that carries the mantle of the industry-leading performance very well compared to the V1, and is a very impressive mouse overall in my opinion. And just like the V1, one of the key aspects to Endgame Gear's products, specifically their wired ones, is their repairability, as the V2 is just as serviceable as the V1 is, meaning that repairing or modding this mouse is extremely easy compared to many other mice on the market. And as such, I wanted to make a quick teardown video to show you all how to fully disassemble and reassemble this mouse if you plan on modding it or repairing any of its components. But as always, before we do any teardowns, we will need a couple tools. Firstly, having a precision set of screwdrivers is highly recommended. Now, all the screws inside the OP1 are standard Phillips heads bits, but having a kit with a variety of sizes is recommended. And since the mouse uses JST connectors for all of its modular components, having a pair of pliers to remove said connectors will be helpful. You can remove them by hand, but it's a little easier with a dedicated tool. And having a silicone soldering mat or a similar kind of repair mat will be very beneficial. Now, I like to use a soldering mat as it has built-in component storage for all the mouse's components and a screw tracker, but you can use pretty much whatever you want. Just make sure however you do this, you have some way of keeping track of all the mouse's components and the screws and where they came from inside the unit. But once you've assembled all your tools, you're ready to go ahead and tear down the Endgame Gear OP1 AKV2, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, starting off, we're going to grab a 000 Phillips heads bit here, and we're going to go ahead and flip the mouse over. Now, normally on many mice we take them apart, you need to remove the stock skates, as almost every brand on the market covers these base access screws with their skates. However, as I talked about in my review, both the hybrid and full-size skates that are included with the OP1AK have little holes milled into them or don't cover the base access screws, meaning you can take the mouse apart and service it without ruining the PTFE skates, which is a great attention to detail and something I wish more brands would implement on their products. Now, on the base, we're going to go ahead and remove a screw from here and a screw from here to disconnect the base from the top shell. Once removed, go ahead and flip the mouse over and make a little pincer with your fingers and put pressure on the sides of the shell here and here, and with a little bit of pressure the back will open up, and then you can take a pry tool and run it along the side of the shell to disconnect all of its clamps. Just like that. Once that's done, you can go ahead and separate the shells, but the base shell is anchored into the top shell by two prongs toward the front here, so you might need to pull the shells up and out of each other, kind of like that, to disconnect them. Now, opening the shell, we see there's all these JST connectors on the inside here, which we can remove pretty easily. We'll start off with the side button PCB's connector, and then the left clicks connector, and flipping the shell over, we'll do the same thing for the right click connector. And once all those JST connectors are disconnected, you can separate the top and base shells just as you could on the V1. Now, we're going to put the base shell off to the side for now, and we'll go ahead and disassemble the top shell first. Alright, now the top shell here is going to be a pretty straightforward process, very similar to the disassembly process we found on the V1. Firstly, we're going to go ahead and remove the modular main click PCBs located here and here, which are anchored in by a screw here, 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 and here. Alright, and then with those screws removed, the PCBs will fall out of the shell very easily as they're just loosely held in by those screws. We'll put them off to the side for now. Next, we'll flip the shell over and we can go ahead and remove the side button PCB, which is held in by two screws located here and here. And once removed, you can try grabbing the top of this connector and gently pulling it up, but sometimes the board is quite firmly stuck in here, in which cases I'd recommend taking a pry tool, hooking it under the PCB and just gently pulling up as best as you can on the corners to gently remove the PCB from its little slot there. And here we have the side button PCB, which we'll put off to the side. And then with the side button PCB removed, we can also remove the main clicks, which is quite easy as they are just hooked into these little latches on the side here. So you can just pull up from the back here, just to gently disconnect them, and they will fall right out of the shell. And lastly, we can go ahead and remove the main clicks themselves, which are anchored in by a screw here, 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 and here. Alright, and then once those screws are removed, take your finger or a pry tool and just reach up in the back of the clicks to disconnect them from their standoffs, and the clicks will fall out of the shell just like that. And here we have the main clicks themselves, which we'll put off to the side. And with that removed, that is everything for the top shell here on the OP1AK. But before we move on, I did want to highlight one great attention to detail here from them. As you can see, the pilot holes for the base and the main click PCBs have been metal threaded, which is a fantastic attention to detail, as oftentimes over longer term use, these pilot holes will get rather fragile, especially ones that get used very frequently, like base access screws here. And in some cases, the plastic can actually get so brittle, it can actually break when you retension the screws. So having the metal threaders here and on the main clicks is a really nice attention to detail, as it ensures these pilot holes will never break over long-term use. Personally speaking though, I would have liked to see them on the main clicks as well, as again, over long-term use, the main clicks can get a little loose. And having metal pilot holes here to ensure you can retension the clicks properly without worrying about the plastic breaking would have been nice to see, but that's a very minimal nitpick, and this is still a massive improvement over what we see on most mice. Alright, with the top shell all finished up, we'll put that off to the side for now, and we'll bring back over our base shell, and now we can disassemble this. Alright, starting off with the base shell, the first thing we're going to do is disconnect the mouse's power cable, which we can do so relatively easily. Now, I would recommend using a fingernail for this part, not necessarily pliers, as this part is a little more delicate, but you can remove this by just getting a fingernail in on each side and just gently wiggling up on this connector as much as you can, and with enough pressure, it will disconnect itself from the board just like that. Once that's done, you can now remove the anchoring screws for the PCB, which are located here, here, and here. And with those screws removed, we can now just gently pick up the PCB, just pulling it straight up as to not damage the scroll wheel, as there are standoffs here, and we can remove it from the base shell. And we can also take out the scroll wheel itself by just gently pulling it to the right to disconnect it from its encoder. Alright, and then with that removed, we can also remove the power cable itself here. As you can see, it is run through the top shell here. And we can start off by disconnecting the front here, and there's a little clip towards the middle here. And with that removed, we can disconnect the power cable. So in the future, if you need to replace this power cable, if it gets damaged for whatever reason, or you just want to mod it for a lighter, more flexible cable type, you can do so very easily here. Alright, and that is everything for the base shell disassembly here on the OP1AK V2. A very easy process, just as it was in the V1, which is awesome to see. Next, putting this off to the side, I'm going to go ahead and grab our main board, our side button PCB, and the two main click PCBs, and talk about the mouse's specs and PCB layouts next. Alright, starting off with the side button PCB, here we'll find two Kailh GM 2.0 full-size switches, which unlike the half-size switches we commonly see used for many mice's side buttons, do have a full cycle rating of 20 million cycles, which is far superior than the 5 to 3 million cycle ratings we commonly see used on side button switches. The full-size nature of these switches also gives them great rebound and click feel compared to the half-size switches we commonly see, and they connect to the main board via this larger 4-pin JST connector. Moving on to the main click PCB, these are the soldered versions of the main click PCBs with the Kailh GX switches on them, which are Endgame Gear's bread and butter, as these are SPDT switches that use a dual contact system to give them industry-leading click latency and overall performance. And these PCBs connect to the main board via these 3-pin JST connectors. And as I mentioned in my full review, Endgame Gear does offer switch packs that offer a hot swap PCB of the same type or other binned GX switches here, so you can customize the click feel of the OP1AK to your preference, which is a great attention to detail. And if you want to learn more about the switch packs and what they offer, you can check out their respective segment in my full review. And lastly, we have the main board, which is very different from the main PCB we saw in the OP1 V1, as it has been sized down significantly. In addition to its smaller size, it's also actually moddable by default, as you can actually cut off this smaller back part of the PCB here to reduce the PCB's footprint, making it even smaller and lighter. But in doing so, you will remove this little button here, which corresponds to the mode button on the bottom of the mouse. But if you care about modding or putting this PCB into another mouse, this is a great option to see. Now on the board itself, we do have a custom Pixar 3950U+1F95A, which is a fully custom sensor developed by Endgame Gear and Pixar, which offers fantastic performance compared to the 3395 we saw in the OP1 V1, and has a lot of great features, specifically the widest sensor tilt range I've ever seen on a sensor to date. And as I just mentioned, this sensor is a notable improvement from the one we saw in the V1, and definitely worth upgrading upgrading to the V2 for, as it offers great performance. For the MCU, in the middle here we have a Nuvoton M483 MCU, the same MCU type used on the V1. Now the reason why they didn't use a Nordic SoC or the traditional MCU types we often see other brands use is that those MCUs don't support 8 kHz polling by default, they only support 1 kHz, and seeing as this is a wired mouse supporting 8 kHz, they went for the Nuvoton as it supports that natively, and the MCU is very well implemented and further improves the mouse's overall performance. Next, for the wheel click, we have another KL GM2.0 switch, the same switch as we saw on the side buttons, which again, unlike most wheel click switches, which are pillar switches with their spongy click feel and really low cycle ratings, this switch is rated for 20 million cycles and has a fantastic click feel and gives a great tension feel to the scroll wheel. And on the topic of scroll wheel, inside here we have a brand new encoder type, being a KL 24-step dust-proof 9mm encoder. This is one of the biggest improvements here on the V2, as on the V1, Endgame gear used a TTC silver encoder, which are notorious for being a little unreliable in terms of their long-term usage, and as such, Endgame gear went for a much stronger, more durable encoder here, though the scroll force of this wheel is much stronger than the TTC one, roughly double, which may take some time to get accustomed to, but it is a very well implemented encoder and a great update to see here from Endgame gear. Alright, but that is everything for the mouse's PCBs and specs. We'll put these all off to the side for now, and now we can talk about the mouse's individual component weights. Alright, as a preface to this segment, Endgame Gear is advertising that the OP1 AKV2 will weigh 49.5 grams. Now there is no plus-minus gram ratio onto this weight spec, but I assume the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams applies here. And in the mouse's base configuration with no grips or skates, the mouse weighs 48.2 grams. With the half-size skates installed or its stock configuration, the mouse weighs exactly 49.5 grams. And with the mouse's full-size skates, the mouse weighs 50.8 grams. And if you plan on using the included grip aids, they do increase the mouse's weight slightly, as with the half-size skates and the grips, the mouse's weight goes up to around 50 grams, and with the full-size skates and the grips, the mouse's weight increases to 51.3 grams. But regardless, in all situations with all the included accessories, the mouse is still within its 49.5 plus-minus 2 gram weight spec, which is expected here as Endgame Gear has historically been very accurate with their weight specs, but it's great to see that continue here on the OP1 AKV2. Alright, now starting off with component weights, starting off with the top shell with everything removed from it. It weighs a total of 16.71 grams, whereas the base shell with everything removed from it weighs around 9.32 grams. One main click weighs around 2.5 grams, meaning collectively they weigh around 5 grams. The modular main click PCBs only weigh 2.60 grams, which is very impressive given their size, whereas the side button PCB is also very light, weighing only 2.11 grams. The side buttons themselves only weigh 0.81 grams, the scroll wheel weighs 1.76 grams, and the main PCB, due to its redesign being much smaller than the PCB we saw inside the V1, weighs only 5.54 grams. And if you snap off the rear part of this PCB, just like that, that reduces its weight to 5.22 grams. And lastly, all the screws inside the OP1AK V2 collectively weigh 1.41 grams. Alright, that is everything for the mouse's component weights. Next, let's go ahead and start our reassembly process, and we're going to start off with the base shell here. Alright, now the base shell's reassembly process is going to be pretty straightforward. However, before we do anything else, we do need to reinstall this cable, which can be a little finicky in some cases. Now you want to orient this cable with its natural tilt going upwards, or with this slant facing the bottom of the mouse like this, and it just slots into the front of this connector as there's this tiny little spot for it, and you can just slot it in just like that. And then, you can take the cable and run it around the side of the mouse just like this, and it should look roughly like that, as that allows the PCB to go over top and leaves the cable right next to where its power cable is going to go. With the cable reinstalled, we can now go ahead and grab our slightly smaller main click PCB since we removed this end piece. We'll also go ahead and grab our scroll wheel. We'll grab the thinner end of the wheel and gently put it into that small black hole in the encoder and gently put it in just like that. Now you don't want to push it in all the way because we do have to worry about the tolerances here for their standoffs. You want to put the wheel kind of like that, enough where the thicker part of the wheel still sits over this KL GM2.0 switch and can be actuated easily. easily. And once installed, we can now take this PCB and just drop it down into the base shell just like that and push it all the way in like that to clip it onto its standoffs. And then we can go ahead and reinstall the 2 anchoring screws here and here. Now if you keep your PCB in its full size configuration, this little piece is going to go onto the back here, meaning you will have to put another anchoring screw towards the back here. But since I removed it on my unit, we're just going to put in these 2 anchoring screws here. Alright, and once all those screws are reconnected, go ahead and check the scroll wheel just to make sure it still actuates. Again, as long as you positioned it properly in the front shell, there shouldn't be any issues, but you can always adjust the wheel as needed at this point. But as long as it's functioning correctly, you can still scroll wheel click. You can now go over to this larger JST plug over here. You want to gently line it up with its connector on the side here, gently seat it into place, and then take 2 of your fingernails and just clip it into place just like that. Now at this point, just to be safe, I'd recommend taking the mouse, plugging it in, and turning it on to make sure it functions. If the mouse doesn't turn on, this cable is most likely not seated properly, so disconnect and reconnect it as needed. But you shouldn't have any issues with this connector as it's pretty reliable, but if you have any weird issues, just reconnect it and it should be fine. And with that, that is everything for the base shell reassembly process here for the OP1 AK V2, a very easy reassembly process, which is great to see. We'll put that off to the side for now, and now we can go ahead and reassemble the top shell. Alrighty, now the top shell here for the OP1 is going to be a very easy reassembly process just as the base shell was. And firstly, we're going to go ahead and start off with the main clicks. Now the trick for these is you see this hollow kind of arch over here. This is the stabilizer for the main click, and that has to go over this tiny little protruding piece right here. So you have to orient the clicks into the base by putting them in through the bottom and then kind of roughly putting them into place while also pushing them in and over. Push them in like that so it sits over its stabilizer contact, and then once it's over its little standoffs, press down to clip it into place. We'll do the same process with the ones here, in through the bottom, up through the top, line it up over the stabilizer, click it into place just like that. Very, very, very easy to reinstall. Next, we can go ahead and reinstall the 4 anchoring screws here, but as a preface to this, as always when we retension any kind of main click screw, you need to be very careful with them, as over-tensioning the screws can break the main clicks and under-tensioning them can ruin the click feel. So the rule of thumb for these screws is you always want to screw them in until you feel a little bit of feedback. You should never over-tension these screws under any circumstances. It's better to under-tension them as adjust as needed than over-tension them and ruin the clicks. Also, due to the way the shell is designed, I'd recommend putting the screws in with the shell angled upwards like this, as if pressure is applied to the shell buttons, it could knock them off of their stabilizers. So make sure to orient the shell like this, and keeping in mind the tensioning warning I just gave you, we can re-anchor the 4 anchoring screws. Alright, and once these screws are tensioned in, go ahead and check your main clicks and make sure they have a nice snappy kind of buoyant feeling to them like this. If the clicks are very stiff and don't go down all the way or take a lot of pressure to click, you've most likely over-tensioned the screws, and if you've under-tensioned the screws, they'll probably sit down like this and not really have much of a rebound to them. But as long as you tension them properly, they should have a nice natural buoyancy just like that, and that's how you want them to be. With the main clicks reinstalled, we can go ahead and grab our side buttons and reinstall them next, and we can do so by clipping on the ends of this little connector onto the little standoff here and here. So just gently drop them into place into the top shell, press them down just like that to reinstall the side buttons. And before you move on, just make sure you can actually actuate the side buttons to make sure they're not jammed or something like that, but as long as they're installed properly, you are good to go. Next, we can go ahead and take our side button PCB and re-anchor that. Now it goes into the shell in this orientation. It kind of sits into these little slots right here and here, and getting it in can be kind of tricky sometimes. So if you need a hand, I'd recommend taking a pair of tweezers and just gently dropping it into its little standoffs. So there, and just gently push it down into place. Just like that. And you can tell it's in place all the way as the back part of that PCB is flush with the plastic, just as the front is there. Now before you screw them in, flip the shell over and just make sure the clicks actually work, which both of ours do. If your clicks have a really high actuation weight or aren't clicking, check the positioning of the PCB as it may be too high or too low, but as long as you installed it properly, the click should function no problem. And then with that PCB reinstalled, we can go ahead and reinstall the anchoring screw that goes here and here. And once those screws are installed, just to be thorough, double check the buttons just to make sure they still function and that the PCB didn't shift during the installation here. And lastly, now we can go ahead and reinstall the PCBs, which are very easy to install, as all you do is kind of drop them onto the little standoffs here and here. However, it's important to note that these JST connectors are slightly directional, so what I recommend doing is grabbing the base shell and check what side these JST connectors normally go on. So this one appears to go on this side, and this one appears to go on this side like this. Now, of course, you can always just take the connector and turn it to use it as will, but I like just to be on the safe side and just use the proper siding just so there's no extra strain on the cables. I know it's not really an issue area per se, but it's something to keep in mind. So go ahead and do that and find which ones go on what side, and then you can go ahead and go back to your top shell, gently position the PCB onto its standoffs just like that, and then take the two anchoring screws and re-anchor the PCB. Alright, and then once those are reinstalled, go ahead and check your main clicks to make sure they still function, which they do. Now, in some very rare cases, sometimes the PCB can slightly slip off of its standoff, which can result in the click being a little weirdly heavy. So just double check to make sure the PCB is sitting flush on its standoff just as they are here, so you don't have any weird click issues. Alright, and that is everything for the top shell here. We'll go ahead and grab our base shell, and now we can go ahead and reassemble the unit. Now, unlike a lot of other mice we've taken apart here on the channel, they often use ribbon cables, which are very finicky to work with. Since all the modular components use JST connectors, the reassembly process for this mouse is very easy. We'll start off with the side button connector, which goes into this larger plug here, and we can anchor it in just like that. And we'll flip the shell over and do the other button as well, just like that. And once everything is connected, before you do anything else, I'd recommend taking the mouse, plugging it into your computer, and checking all the buttons' functions. So make sure your side buttons work, make sure your scroll wheel works and scroll wheel click works, and check the main clicks as well to make sure they are all fully functional. Now, if one of these top shell components isn't working, it's most likely the JST connector not being seated properly, so just disconnect it and reconnect it, and it should fix whatever issues you have. And once you've tested all the functions of the unit, go ahead and put the shells just roughly together, kind of like this. And what you want to do is just kind of push the top shell into the base like that, because there are the two clips at the top there. So just once again to show you, just kind of put the shells roughly together like this, and just push forward like that to push it into place. Now, the primary clips are of course up here. There's not really a lot running around the side of the mouse, but you can run your hand around the side just to make sure everything makes proper contact. And once the shells are connected, just put a finger over the base here to hold it into place, and we can re-anchor these two base screws. And then with that done, you can go ahead and use the mouse, since we don't have to remove the stock skates to open the mouse. But if you did remove them, you can just reinstall your preferred set of aftermarket skates. And that concludes your teardown of the Endgame Gear OP1 AK V2. Overall, just like the OP1 AK V1, this mouse is extremely serviceable and very moddable, as this is the first time I've ever seen a stock PCB have a portion you can just break off to make it even smaller, which is a really cool little attention to detail. Yes, of course, this does remove the functionality of the mode button on the bottom of the mouse, but if you care about weight and making this PCB as small as possible to put it in another mouse or do modding options for it or do whatever you want with it, this is a really cool attention to detail. And of course, the mouse itself is very moddable, which is great to see. And again, just like the OP1 AK V1, it's extremely serviceable as well, as if a component inside the mouse, such as the main clicks or the scroll wheel or even the cable fails, you can replace them very easily, which you can't say for a lot of other mice on the market. And again, the fantastic serviceability just adds on to the overall fantastic experience here on the OP1 AK. And again, this mouse is a fantastic improvement coming from the V1, not only in terms of its updated design, but also of course the new sensor, which is very well implemented. But with that, that concludes today's episode of Teardown, focusing on the Endgame Gear OP1 AK V2. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to Endgame Gear for sending the OP1 AK V2 over for review and of course teardown. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel. I do in-depth reviews and teardown guides like this for every mouse I cover here on the channel, so if you want to see more mice taken apart like this, be sure to get subscribed today. And if you want to support my efforts on the channel with the in-depth reviews and of course the teardown project, please consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support the channel and the teardown project, and channel members get early access to all upcoming content, including videos like this one. But that's everything for today. Thanks again for watching my teardown of the Endgame Gear OP1 AK, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of Teardown. Peace.